What if the person who held your fate in their hands was the one who abandoned you? And what if today was the day they had to face the truth? Courtroom, a place of justice or a place of secrets. The courtroom was packed, lawyers murmuring, spectators watching, reporters scribbling down notes. The air was thick with tension, every eye on the young boy standing at the center of the room. His name was Jaden Williams, a 12-year-old with a reputation for trouble, but behind his hardened exterior lay a sharp mind and a heart that had been repeatedly let down by a system that was supposed to protect him. Jaden stood tall, shoulders squared, even though the accusations stacked against him seemed overwhelming. Trespassing. They said he'd been caught in an abandoned building, hiding out, taking what didn't belong to him. But Jaden knew the truth, his truth, and today he was going to make sure everyone else knew it too. Sitting high on the judge's bench was Judge Rebecca Hart, respected, powerful, feared. Her gaze swept across the courtroom with a practiced calm, her stern demeanor reflecting the decades of experience that had solidified her position at the top. She had sentenced criminals, ended lives with the swing of a gavel, and walked through cases with a mind that left little room for error. In this room, her word was law, and there was no space for doubt. But today, she was about to face a truth even she wasn't ready for. Jaden's eyes stayed locked on her as she called the court to order. The whispers around the room grew quiet, and the eyes of the courtroom turned to the boy at the center of it all. Jaden's heart beat hard in his chest, but his face remained steady, showing no signs of fear. He wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever again. "Jaden Williams?" Judge Hart's voice boomed. "You stand accused of trespassing on private property. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jaden's mouth was dry, but he cleared his throat and took a deep breath. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." A murmur ran through the room. A 12-year-old speaking up in front of a judge. This wasn't something most children would dare to do. But Jaden wasn't most children. "I didn't trespass," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I was there because I had to be." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by his response. "Explain yourself, young man." Jaden swallowed, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on him. Every person in this room, from the lawyers to the reporters to the spectators, was waiting for him to crack, waiting for him to admit his guilt. But Jaden wasn't going to let that happen. "You see," he began, his eyes sweeping the room, "I don't have a home. Not really. The foster system, it doesn't work for people like me. I go from house to house, and I get treated like I don't matter." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air, giving the room a moment to digest what he was saying. Judge Hart didn't interrupt, but she shifted in her seat, clearly listening. This wasn't the typical defense she heard from kids in trouble. Jaden's words were cutting through the surface, showing a side of the story no one was prepared to hear. Jaden continued, his voice gaining strength. "I wasn't in that building because I wanted to cause trouble. I was in there because there's nowhere else for me to go. It was shelter. It was safe." His fists clenched at his sides as he finished. "I'm not a criminal, Your Honor. I'm just a kid trying to survive." The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Hart's face softened just slightly, a flicker of something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wasn't used to hearing children speak so honestly, especially children like Jaden, who had always been dismissed by the system. Jaden stood tall, despite the heaviness of the moment, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for the truth to be seen, for his humanity to be recognized. For the first time in his life, he was being heard, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Judge Hart flipped through the case file, her sharp eyes scanning the details of Jaden Williams's file. She had seen thousands of cases in her career, most of them mundane, a few tragic, and even fewer memorable. But as she read through the accusations against Jaden, trespassing and resisting arrest, her mind started to race with familiar thoughts. He was just another kid from the system, another statistic, another child to judge and move through the process. Or so she thought. Her voice was sharp when she spoke. Jaden Williams, charged with trespassing and resisting arrest. The state recommends probation. Do you have anything to say before sentencing? Jaden stood slowly, his body tense, but his gaze was unwavering. His heart pounded, but he had made his decision. Today, he wasn't just going to be another name on a docket. He was going to be seen. For the first time, he was going to demand the world pay attention. He took a deep breath and locked eyes with Judge Hart. "Yeah, I have something to say," he replied, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "You're my mom." The room went silent. The sound of pens hitting paper, the soft shuffle of papers, everything stopped. The air seemed to thicken. Gasps rippled through the room. Lawyers froze, their mouths slightly agape. The reporters' fingers stumbled over the keys, unsure whether they had heard what they thought they had heard. Judge Hart's face went pale, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The words had hit her like a slap, sharp and unexpected. She blinked, trying to process what Jaden had just said. She had spent years in the courtroom dealing with everything from criminal trials to family disputes. But this was different. The gavel was resting quietly in front of her, but her grip on it tightened. She had never been faced with something like this. The child standing in front of her, the one whose future was in her hands, was now accusing her of something she hadn't been prepared for. "You're my mom," Jaden repeated, his voice more powerful this time, his gaze unwavering. There was no hesitation in his words, no fear. He had lived with this truth for as long as he could remember, and now he wasn't going to hide from it any more. His words hung in the air, a challenge and a demand. Judge Hart's hands trembled slightly as she closed the case file in front of her. This was no longer just about legalities and charges. This was something personal, something raw. She had been judging him, passing judgment on a child who had been through the system, treated like he didn't matter, forced to survive in a world that wasn't built for him. But now, here he was, staring at her with eyes that demanded to be seen. And with one simple sentence, he had shaken her to her core. Her mind raced as she tried to gather her thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared to hear the truth that was suddenly being thrown at her, a truth that made her feel uncomfortable in her own skin. How had this happened? How had she, a judge who had ruled on hundreds of cases, been caught off guard by something so personal? Jaden didn't break his gaze. He didn't flinch, didn't apologize. He had nothing to apologize for. His words were clear, direct, and honest. "Judge Hart," he said, his voice more vulnerable now, but still full of strength. "You're the one who left me. You're the one who walked away and never came back. I don't know why. I don't know what happened. But I've been waiting my whole life for someone to come back, someone to say they care. And now, I don't even know if I should call you Mom anymore. But you're the only one who could give me the answers." Silence fell over the room again. The weight of his words hit every person present. There was no escaping the truth he had just spoken. He wasn't just any kid who had run into trouble. He was a kid who had been abandoned, left in a system that had failed him time and time again. He was a child trying to make sense of a world that hadn't given him the chance to be seen. Judge Hart swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, anything. But for the first time in years, she didn't have the words. She was a judge, yes. She had seen it all, but she had never been in this position before. Never had the tables been turned on her so completely. Jaden wasn't asking for pity. He wasn't asking for her to be sorry. He wasn't even asking for answers. What he was asking for, in that one simple sentence, was recognition. Recognition of the child who had been left behind, the child who had survived despite the odds. And now, for the first time, he wasn't just a foster child. He was a person who had something to say. The courtroom buzzed softly with murmurs, but in that moment, Jaden and Judge Hart were the only two people in the room. The power had shifted. And for the first time in his life, Jaden wasn't just another face in the system. He was someone whose voice mattered. What would you have done in Jaden's place? Let us know in the comments. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Hart's hands shook slightly as she gripped the edge of the bench, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being in control, on knowing the law, knowing what was right. But here she was, caught in a moment she couldn't control, unable to ignore the gravity of what was happening in front of her. Jaden's words echoed in her mind, louder than anything she had ever heard in her years on the bench. You gave me up when you were 18. I was just a baby. And you never looked back. The simple truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind tried to push the memory away. The life she had built, the years of service to the law, the accomplishments, all seemed irrelevant in that instant. Her pulse quickened as she stood motionless, the gavel no longer a symbol of authority, but an unspoken reminder of the life she had left behind. "That's impossible," she whispered under her breath, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Deep down, somewhere in the deepest part of her soul, she knew Jaden's words were real. "I don't have a son," she repeated, more forcefully, trying to convince herself that her reality hadn't been shattered. But the doubt crept in. How could she ignore the fact that this young boy in front of her, standing so tall and full of defiance, carried her blood? Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her chest as the truth pressed down on her. Jaden stepped forward, unwavering. His voice trembled, but his eyes burned with truth. His words pierced through her defenses, cutting through the years of emotional walls she had built. "You gave me up when you were 18. I was just a baby, and you never looked back." The courtroom held its breath. The onlookers, the lawyers, the witnesses, everyone was silent. No one dared to speak, no one dared to breathe. All eyes were fixed on Jaden and Judge Hart. He was a child who had lived through the torment of abandonment, and she was the woman who had made that choice. Judge Hart's fingers trembled over the gavel, her knuckles turning white. The weight of the moment felt unbearable. She had ruled on thousands of cases. She had put away criminals. She had handled divorces, child custody battles, and business disputes. But this was a truth she couldn't ignore. This was personal. Her throat tightened, and she couldn't swallow. The memories came flooding back. The decisions she had made so long ago, the reasons she had given herself for walking away. She had told herself she wasn't ready. She had convinced herself that she had no place in a child's life. She had blamed her age, her career, her ambitions. She had told herself the child would be better off without her. But now, standing in front of her, was the child she had abandoned, a child who had grown into a young man, still fighting for his place in the world, still searching for love and acceptance. And she couldn't deny it any longer. He was hers. Jaden's gaze never wavered. His shoulders were squared, his eyes locked onto hers, but there was no malice in them, just a quiet, desperate plea for acknowledgement. "You're my mom," he said again, as if repeating it would somehow make the truth undeniable, make her see him for who he really was. Her chest tightened, and for the first time in years, the walls she had built around her emotions cracked. This was her fault. She had chosen a career over a child. She had chosen her own life, her own future, over the son who had been born into a world where he had no place. "Jaden," she whispered, her voice breaking. She wanted to say something, anything that could make up for the years she had lost, for the child she had rejected. But no words came. No apology seemed enough. What would she do now? Would she acknowledge him? Would she finally face the consequences of her decisions? "You sent me into the system," Jaden said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You let me bounce from home to home, while you sat up there in your black robe, judging other people's mistakes." Every word was like a dagger to her chest. He was right. He had been in foster care, bounced from one home to another, never knowing stability, never knowing love. She had let him slip through her fingers, and now, all these years later, he stood in front of her, broken and angry, demanding answers. Judge Hart's throat tightened as she struggled to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She had spent so many years building a wall around her emotions, bearing the guilt and the shame of her decision, convincing herself that she had done the right thing. But standing there, seeing the pain in Jaden's eyes, she knew the truth. She hadn't done the right thing. She had done what was easy, what was expected of her. She had let her parents' pressure dictate her actions, and in doing so, she had abandoned her own flesh and blood. For the first time in years, Judge Hart wasn't the one in control. She wasn't the one passing judgment. She was the one being judged, and she couldn't escape it. The weight of it all, the guilt, the regret, the realization that she had failed him, crushed her. Jaden's gaze softened, but his pain was still there. "You never even tried to find me," he said, his voice quieter now, but still filled with the raw emotion of a child who had been neglected by the one person who should have cared for him the most. "I was just a mistake to you, a problem you didn't want to deal with." Judge Hart's heart shattered as she heard the words she never wanted to hear. She had told herself over the years that she had done what was best for him, that by giving him up, she had given him a chance at a better life. But now, looking at him, she realized how wrong she had been. The system had failed him. The families he had been placed with had failed him. And she, his own mother, had failed him the most. Her breath caught as she looked at Jaden, standing before her, a young man who had been denied the love and care he deserved. She wanted to apologize, wanted to say all the things she should have said years ago, but the words wouldn't come. How could she ever make up for what she had done? How could she ever undo the damage that had been done to him? The courtroom was still. No one moved, no one spoke. The weight of the moment was too heavy, too profound to be ignored. Judge Hart wiped away a tear, but it wasn't enough to stop the flood of emotions that had been building inside her for so long. She had spent so many years burying her guilt, hiding behind her role as a judge, pretending that she hadn't made the biggest mistake of her life. But now, standing in front of Jaden, she could no longer hide from the truth. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She had no power here. She wasn't the judge. She was the one who had failed. "Jaden," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I can't take back what I've done, but I swear to you, I will never let you go again." Jaden didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, both hurt and hopeful, spoke volumes. The tears that were now rolling down Judge Hart's face were not just for the years lost, but for the child she had abandoned. The child who had stood up to her, demanded answers, and finally, after all these years, forced her to confront the truth. The silence in the room lingered, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment where a mother's guilt met her son's pain. And while the road ahead would be long, the first step toward healing had been taken. Do you think she deserves forgiveness? The question echoed in the room, but it wasn't just for Judge Hart. It was for Jaden, too. The forgiveness he needed, the forgiveness he deserved, was something only he could give. But for now, in this moment, there was only the truth. And the truth was that sometimes, even after all the mistakes, it's never too late to try. Jaden's tears came harder now. The anger, the resentment, the pain, everything he had carried inside for years was coming to the surface. But there was something else, too. Relief. Hope. Something he had given up on feeling long ago. He let himself cry, letting the weight of the moment wash over him. His body shook with emotion, his hands trembling at his sides. For years, he had told himself he didn't need her. He didn't need anyone. But here she was in front of him, finally acknowledging him. Finally taking responsibility. It was everything he had ever wanted. Judge Hart reached out, gently touching his arm. "I know I can never undo the past, but I want to make it right," she said softly. "I want to be here for you. I want to be the mother you deserve." The crowd was still silent, but there was a shift in the air. Some were moved by the sincerity of the moment. Others were shocked at the rawness of it all. No one had expected this kind of confrontation to happen in a courtroom. "I've spent my whole life thinking I was a mistake," Jaden said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'm not, and neither are you." A tear slid down Judge Hart's face as she looked at him, her heart swelling with the truth of his words. "No, you're not a mistake, Jaden. And I'm so sorry it took me so long to realize that." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The past could not be changed, but the present, this moment, was theirs to claim. Jaden wiped his eyes, trying to steady himself. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if he could forgive her completely. But in this moment, he realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't something that had to happen overnight. It was something that could grow piece by piece. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward healing. The courtroom remained silent as mother and son stood face to face for the first time in 12 long years. The lawyers, the jury, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something monumental, something beautiful. Judge Hart reached out and embraced Jaden, holding him close as if trying to make up for lost time. The courtroom was still, silent in reverence, unsure of what would come next. For Jaden, it didn't matter what happened next. He had his answer. He had the closure he had spent so long searching for. And for Judge Hart, it was a moment of reckoning, a moment when she could no longer hide from her past and, for the first time, could begin to heal. As they stood there, in the center of the courtroom, everything shifted. The weight of the years, the mistakes, the judgment, all of it faded away. There was only one truth left. The truth that love, even after all the pain, had the power to change everything. And in that moment, Jaden realized something he had never understood before. Forgiveness wasn't just about letting go. It was about choosing to move forward, together. Dismiss the charges, effective immediately. Her voice was firm, clear, decisive. This case is over. Jaden's breath hitched. His hands trembled slightly, his mind racing to process what had just happened. For the first time in his life, he wasn't a case file. He wasn't just another statistic. The weight of his history, the years spent in foster homes, the days he spent wondering if anyone cared about him. Now, all of that was gone. He was free. But more than that, he was finally seen. As the room buzzed with whispers and gasps, Judge Hart turned to the adoption official. "I want to file for legal guardianship." She spoke with an urgency that made the room go still. Today. The words were simple, but their impact was profound. The judge, the woman who had once abandoned him, now wanted to bring him home. Jaden stood frozen, his eyes searching her face, as if waiting for her to backtrack, to say it was all some cruel mistake. But there was no hesitation in her expression, no sign of doubt. All he saw was truth. Her sincerity was undeniable. He wanted to scream, to shout, to run out of the courtroom with joy. But instead, he stood still, taking it all in. For the first time in 12 years, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't dared to believe in: hope. Jaden blinked hard, as though waking up from a long, painful dream. He looked at the adoption official, who nodded in confirmation. "We can start the paperwork today." It was a moment that would define the rest of his life. This moment of redemption, of reconciliation, was something that even the harshest of realities couldn't take away from him. Judge Hart's voice softened as she turned to him. "Come on, son. Let's go home." Jaden's heart swelled with emotion. The words that had once been impossible for him to imagine, "Let's go home," had now become his reality. His legs felt weak beneath him, but his heart was strong. After everything he had been through, the loneliness, the rejection, the uncertainty, this was the moment that defined who he was and who he could become. He hesitated for only a second. Just one brief, final moment of doubt. But then he took her hand, the hand of the woman who had abandoned him, but had now chosen him. They weren't strangers anymore. In that simple act of trust, they became family. Together they walked out of the courtroom not as a judge and a child, but as a mother and son, finally given a second chance. The room remained still, a quiet kind of awe settling over the spectators. They had witnessed something rare, a broken bond restored, the start of a new chapter for both of them. As they made their way toward the exit, Jaden's steps were steady. He wasn't the same boy who had walked in that morning. He was someone new, someone who could believe that sometimes justice wasn't just about laws. It was about love. It was about second chances. And for the first time, Jaden knew he had one. The weight he had carried for so long, the loneliness, the pain, it was lifting. With each step he took, he could feel the world opening up in a way he had never imagined. And as they stepped out into the sunlight, Jaden whispered to himself, "Maybe this is what a second chance feels like."